Hi, and welcome to another episode of Hello CISO. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is music to every CISO's ears: compliance. And look, I know it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but it is something that we need to get to grips with. Compliance is inescapable, and in modern times it is often more complex than what it has ever been in the past. Broadly speaking, there are two areas of compliance that we need to touch on. And the first one is that which is required by law. Now, there's not a lot to say about that. You just simply have to do it if you want to operate in a jurisdiction with compliance obligations. But one bit of advice I would offer on that is that always deferring to the most stringent compliance obligations across the jurisdictions which you need to comply with is usually pretty sound advice. Let's take an example where country A in which you operate says you need to check 5 boxes in order to be compliant. Country B says, well, it's only 3 of those boxes that you need for compliance. And then country C, a little bit more relaxed, 1 box. Now, if you can fall back to that position of country A and tick all of the 5 boxes, not only is that going to make you compliant across all of the areas in which you operate, but it gives you a bit of future-proofing should countries B or C increase their compliance regime in the future. The other, and usually more interesting, area of compliance is that which is business driven. So the areas of compliance that your organisation has decided that you should follow, separately to that which may have been imposed by the government in the jurisdiction in which you're operating. Now, this area is where you get to earn your keep as a CISO, looking at how those compliance obligations interact with security and what you can do to make them a differentiator for your business. The impetus from these initiatives can come from everywhere from the CTO through to legal, and every group will want to have input into the process. And of course, you as a CISO should want that. But let's be very business orientated about this, and the best place to start with compliance is the sales department, because you want to understand what compliance initiatives will ultimately affect your ability to sell your product. Will compliance threaten new business? Will it impact existing business? These are very important first questions to ask. These should be your first priorities, at least as far as the non-mandatory compliance regulations go. With sales wish list in hand, you can then chat to your CTO and legal department and proceed from there. The next step is to look into the feasibility of the initiatives and assessing whether they're going to conflict with other things. And they almost certainly will. This is why you can't just simply roll out an org-wide initiative just because someone in compliance feels like it. Unless it's a super narrow change, it can touch everything. Let's take SOC 2 compliance as an example. It will almost certainly affect HR, giving them new obligations. It'll affect developers and the way they work. It'll affect ops. It'll affect IT. This could be a very broad-reaching, high-impact compliance obligation. Since it impacts so many things in so many areas of the business, you're going to have to make a formal case for the change. This is one of these cases where you're going to have to weigh things up and look at them on balance. You're going to have compliance and legal demands on the one side and potential business consequences on the other. You'll also need to be confident that the cost of implementing the change is going to be less than the cost of not implementing the change, even if that cost just comes down to resources. A good CISO needs to not only understand the business imperatives and be able to communicate well, they also need to be able to understand the technical impacts of compliance as well. Compliance is one of these things that can kind of go either way with security. It can have a very positive impact, but equally, it can also have a very negative impact. Let's start with the positive, and I'll give you a perfect example. Compliance regimes can be very good for creating audit trails, which is something that's an extremely important part of security. A compliance regime tends to lead you towards the process of documentation and capturing information. This whole sort of idea of being able to trace things back via audit trails. Auditors really want to be able to peek under the hood of what's going on. They want to be able to see that audit trail. Often, auditors end up digging up practices that affect security but are invisible to most people in the company. Creating an audit trail tends to bring a bunch of the practices and policies out into the open where they can be scrutinised. And from a security perspective, that's a very good thing. On the flip side, compliance can also have a negative impact on security. We're all familiar with compliance very often working quite slow, but the pace of technology speeding ahead in front of it. Let me give you a perfect example of where compliance is holding us back and having a negative impact on security. And that's password practices. So many organisations still have this very old view of password strength. It's a view where we need complexity. An uppercase character, a lowercase, a number, a non-alphanumeric character. Now, what happens when you ask people to adhere to arbitrary password complexity criteria is they fall back to very predictable patterns. So many times I've spoken in front of audiences and I've asked the crowd, if you go to a website and it demands that you have at least one uppercase character, but you're trying to use an all lowercase password, what do you do? And every time, no matter where this audience is in the world, everyone says, you capitalize the first letter. And what happens if you need to have a number? Well, you put a 1 at the end. A non-alphanumeric character, it's an exclamation mark, always at the end. Very, very predictable patterns. So we as an industry have moved away from this. We have very, very strong guidance from industry bodies like NIST and also like the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, who've said stop doing this. Stop demanding password complexity criteria. However, how many compliance policies still demand this? How many audits come back and say you do not implement minimum password complexity criteria, therefore you shall not pass the audit? So there's a perfect example of compliance driving negative security practices. Compliance is bureaucratic. There are many layers of change and the ISO likes to keep things standard and stable and predictable. And sometimes that is even desirable. But that slow pace of change means that by the time compliance hits, it's very often already out of date. Often it means we're guarding against yesterday's threats and not today's. Sometimes it's just an inconvenience. Other times it's downright counterproductive to security. So I lied a little bit about one thing. There's not just two areas of compliance to consider. It's not just the mandatory things and the business-driven ones. There's also the compliance issues that come up after a breach. If you do have the misfortune of suffering a breach, you are almost certainly going to find breaches of compliance itself as you go through the incident response process. It's easy to go through your security chain and find the weak point and zero in on it as being out of compliance and blame that one issue and it alone for the breach. Many people will stop there once they find that one problem, figuring if they fix that thing, they've covered their ass. How is that compliance obligation not met in the first place? What was it about the organisational structure at the time that caused this one obviously very important thing, because it's what led to the breach? What caused that one thing to be out of compliance in the first place? Is that the root cause? And could that root cause have caused other things to fall out of compliance as well? As you start scratching the surface, you may well find much deeper issues. So, rather than stopping at that one thing that was out of compliance that you're blaming for the breach, use this opportunity, and in this case a breach is an opportunity. Treat it as an opportunity to discover more about your organisation that might be out of compliance. One last word of caution. Be very sceptical of any tools claiming to bring you into compliance. Many of these tools allow you to check particular compliance checkboxes, but they do tend to take over your entire security compliance environment, potentially opening you up to new vulnerabilities. I've had so many occasions in the past treading the halls of security conferences, looking at vendors selling compliance products that are going to magically fix all of your problems. And I do wonder how many of them even get close. Definitely do your own investigations and perform your own due diligence on these products. That said, it can be extremely beneficial to lean on organizations that do a good job of this. There are good tools out there. The challenge is just figuring out which ones they are. Find a good one, and it can make the job of your compliance easier. It effectively outsources much of the work that you would do otherwise. It's your job as CISO to tie all these things together and establish a clear path forward. That's all for this episode of Hello CISO. I hope you enjoyed it. Do like and subscribe so you can be notified of the next episode of the series, and stay safe out there. If you've enjoyed this video as part of the Hello CISO series, then please give it a like and subscribe to the 1Password YouTube channel for more videos like this.